All right, Krystal, what's on your radar?
Well, while we were all debating the free speech implications of Barry Weiss self-expelling from the New York Times, a potent example of state-sponsored censorship and stifling of political speech was signed into law in Missouri. So that state became the 32nd in the nation to pass an anti-BDS law barring any state contract from going to a company that supports in any way the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement against Israel. Now, this law, like the others that came before it, actually requires companies with those state contracts to sign a loyalty oath type certification that they are in no way boycotting Israel, Israeli businesses, or even Israeli businesses in the occupied territories. Now, as background here, the BDS movement describes itself as an effort to end international support for Israel's oppression of Palestinians and pressure Israel to comply with international law. It was intentionally modeled after the anti-apartheid movement, which successfully targeted the economy of South Africa. Now, BDS is, of course, highly controversial, although it is mainstream enough now that several members of Congress are supporters. But whether or not it's controversial or whether you personally support it, it's not really the point. Senator Dianne Feinstein is one of the more pro-Israel members of Congress and certainly is no BDS supporter, but she partnered with Bernie Sanders to oppose a similar anti-BDS measure in the Senate on free speech grounds. Laws like this one are bad enough on their face, and they have been challenged successfully in court so far on constitutional grounds. But the consequences are even more far-reaching than you might think at first glance. For example, in Texas, a speech therapist named Bahia Amawi, who had worked in an Austin area school district for years, she went to re-sign her contract as usual for the following school year. Since she was technically an independent contractor rather than an employee, Amawi was asked as part of that contract renewal to sign this anti-BDS pledge, certifying that she would not boycott Israel in any way. Amawi refused to sign, and her contract was terminated as a result. As Glenn Greenwald put it in reporting out the story, in order to continue to work, Amawi would be perfectly free to engage in any political activism against her own country, participate in an economic boycott of any state or city within the U.S., or work against the policies of any other government in the world except Israel. Here, Amawi herself is in a video interview with The Intercept explaining why she would not sign.
I'm an American citizen. I follow the law. And so I have the luxury of having these rights, which many people in other countries do not have. It infringe on all my principles. And on top of that, my right to speech and also right to protest. It's baffling that they can throw this down our throats, and decide to protect another country's economy versus protect our constitutional rights.
Now, it's not just anti-BDS laws either. A rash of anti-free speech laws have been pushed in recent years across the country. According to the ACLU, in the wake of a spate of protests which erupted following Donald Trump's election, nearly 20 states proposed bills that would restrict the right to protest. And in a Kafkaesque move, just weeks ago, a North Carolina city effectively criminalized protests altogether by making it illegal to protest without a permit and then refusing to grant permits. In Louisville, Black Lives Matter activists protested on the lawn of that state's attorney general, demanding the prosecution of police involved in the killing of Breonna Taylor. 87 were arrested and outrageously overcharged with felonies that could result in 1 to 5 years of prison time. The ACLU blasted that move, saying that the only purpose is to potentially chill the free speech rights of protesters. Now, that's, of course, to say nothing of the routine calls from Trump to abridge free speech, whether it's by criminalizing flag burning, changing our libel laws, threatening to send in the military to crush protests, actually sending in the National Guard and military police to crush protests, and there was also that time that he sued Bill Maher over a dumb joke. So here's the thing, and here's why this whole culture of intolerance conversation becomes so complicated. I completely agree that there is a growing intolerance of dissent, and that some of that intolerance, maybe a lot, is located on the political left. There's a growing instinct to label people as beyond the pale, branding them with some label that they can't shake. Racist, fascist, Nazi, anti-Semite, Kremlin agent. When you put that brand on someone, it isn't a descriptive about the person. It encompasses the entirety of that individual. It precludes any hope of recovering or discussion or learning because they are simply labeled as one of the bad ones to be purged. I think that's a dangerous trend, precisely because of the cases that I cite above. Censorship will always fall hardest on the left. Why? Because power will try to quash the speech of those that threaten it. And typically those voices and movements are on the left, whether it was communism or Vietnam or opposition to the Iraq War or BDS. if you tolerate the crushing of dissent in the public square, digital or otherwise, if you target people's jobs, if you routinely label and otherwise tar people in order to render debate impossible, these actions give cover to those who would seek to wield the power of the state for those same ends. But, and here's the other thing, have you heard one of the supposed free speech warriors over on the right, whether Shapiro, Rubin, or whoever, who are so worried about Barry self-expelling and somebody getting deplatformed at a college somewhere, say a single word about the anti-BDS law in Missouri or the other 31 states that passed them? And therein lies the problem, and the one really legitimate critique of the first Harper's open letter. You've got a whole lot of hypocrites out there who want to cry censorship when it suits them, and want to look the other way when it's their opponents who are getting crushed. If you are decrying censorship and attacks on speech, but you aren't talking about a single case in which you not only don't agree, but actually find the argument to be offensive, then frankly, you're full of it. If you're on the left, that might mean sticking up for someone like Tom Cotton or Andy Ngo. And if you're on the right, it might mean decrying anti-BDS laws or standing up for Ilhan Omar. Otherwise, you don't have principles. You just have a rhetorical weapon that you are wielding for your own political ideology like a battle axe. And so I want to be clear here. It's not like everyone has to speak up on every issue.
Yeah.
But if you are only speaking up when it affects your side, then you are not bringing a genuine, like, good faith aspect to this conversation. You're just using it like a rhetorical weapon.
No, I think you're right. And people have to acknowledge it, because what actually drives me more crazy is that there are people on the right who will deny that isn't going after free speech.
Yeah.
It is. And I said this yesterday. The original tactics for much of the pro-Israel movement, when they had a lot more cultural power, frankly, in the country, was they were trying to silence BDS activists and trying to pass laws like this. I think these types of laws are disgraceful. I do think they're anti-American. I don't agree with BDS. That's the thing. It's like, but it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It just does not matter, because if they can criminalize that in Texas, what can they criminalize in New York? What are they going to criminalize in Massachusetts or Boston or San Francisco?
32, right? And 32 states have these laws on the books.
I mean, I've actually even seen, like, here's another case. There are people who are in, like, I think it was in California or maybe New York City, who were charged with, like, a hate crime for vandalizing a Black Lives Matter mural. That's insane. Sorry, that's completely insane. It's the same thing, which is, look, you may support Black Lives Matter. These people are, idiots going through and vandalizing something. That does not mean they should be charged with a federal hate crime, right? I mean, it's ludicrous. And so you have to speak up for it on all of these issues, which is, I think you put it perfectly. Andy Ngo, if you're on the left, BDS people, if you're on the right. It's true, because otherwise they are going to come for you. And it happens every single time. And too often, there are so many hypocrites who speak up for one thing or don't for the other. And in this particular case, there is no way to justify a state government trying to criminalize speech of an American citizen.
Yeah.
There's just not. I mean, there's just no absolute way in order to justify that if you actually really believe in the Constitution and free speech.
Yeah, I mean, if you aren't applying your principles when it's uncomfortable, I don't enjoy defending Tom Cotton here, right? Or saying, like, people shouldn't have been fired
or BDS,
for publishing
no friends around town.
An op-ed, right? That, look, I actually found the content of that op-ed to be offensive, right? I find that position to be wrong and dangerous and offensive. But you have to acknowledge that, first of all, it's a mainstream opinion. He's a United States senator. And look, no one has a right to be published in the New York Times. But the freak out over that and this instinct of, rather than engaging the debate and allowing that to flourish, to push them out of the public square, that has implications beyond just, like, Twitter mobs and even employment. I mean, that has implications for the way how we allow our entire society to be shaped. Because then that provides justification for these types of laws where you say, okay, well, if you can censor that view, then you must be okay with this sort of censorship as well. It provides a sort of landscape of crushing of dissent and intolerance that leads you to a deeply illiberal place, which always ultimately falls hardest on the left. But part of why this conversation is so hard to have, and part of why there are people that I really respect that, like, with the first Harper's letter, were like, this is a bunch of BS, is because you do have so many people who are coming to the conversation in bad faith, who are ultimately hypocritical, who only apply it selectively, who have been actively involved in like cancellation of people that they happen not to like. And so people look at that list of signatories, and even though the content of the letter is completely non-controversial, and I support those, I support the letter, I support the people who signed the letter, but even though the content is non-controversial, they go, you all are selectively applying this. This is not an actual legitimate attempt to have ideological diversity and a flourishing of ideas and support of free speech. This is just another attempt to actually maintain the status quo power and anoint yourselves as the ones who get to say what's inbounds and what's out of bounds.
Yeah, that really is all it is. And it's just not complicated for a lot of people. But I think that the funny part about the letter to me is that these neoliberal centrist leftists only started freaking out when people started canceling them, right? And most of them never spoke up for many people on the right or even on the hard left who were ever targeted.
Yeah.
And that is where the hypocrisy comes into, where it's like a lot of this is just self-interest. In my view, it is actually just the ability to protect the center left to be able to continue to have an opinion, along with the far left.
They want to protect their bad takes.
Or the progressive identitarian left in places like the New York Times. That's all it was. It was like, I don't think they actually care about Tom Cotton or conservative speech.
Well, I mean, you have people like, it's a mix, because you have people like Noam Chomsky on that letter.
Sure.
It's obviously like
He's one of the only ones
deeply committed to the principle at every level. And there's a big difference too between no one is entitled to have an opinion and not like hear feedback or criticism on it, right? That's part of debate.
Yeah, you can be like, this is stupid. I say it here every day.
That's part of debate and discussion, right? And I also want to make clear, like, there are times where you have people who are beyond the pale, who really shouldn't be like platformed in mainstream conversation. But I think the bar for that should be really high, and we should be really careful about applying those labels where it's not about this person's work or ideas, but it's about like labeling this individual as an evil or bad actor altogether, meaning you don't have to deal with them or what they're saying at all. They should just be pushed down altogether. And that's the thing, is I think that the bar for that, it's just thrown around all the time now. It's become practically meaningless. The bar for that needs to remain very high for those words to even have real meaning.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Next on Rising, retired Colonel Mo Davis is running against Madison Cawthorn to fill Mark Meadows' now vacated North Carolina congressional seat, and the former colonel is going to join us to discuss his campaign when Rising continues.